I'm Ellis Cose. I'm an author and I'm a journalist, a lifelong journalist. I've been involved with several large institutions, including Newsweek magazine, including Time, used to run the editorial page of the New York Daily News. And I'm an author. I've written many books dealing with any number of subjects from race in America to post-conflict societies and to democracy. And I'm here today to talk about my new book, which is The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, which is a look at the conundrums that arise when one considers free speech, the history of free speech, and the danger that free speech is in today. I appreciate you tuning in and hope we have a very interesting conversation.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. This is part 2 of a 2-part interview with Ellis Cose. He is a guy with incredible credentials in the context of free speech, the history of riots. He is a Chicago native. He has a master's degree in science, technology, and public policy from the George Washington University. He has been recognized for writing groundbreaking books on subjects like as diverse as rage among black middle class, the evolution of post-conflict societies, and the role of free speech in democracy. Now, this is an amazing man who has got some incredible insights, and his latest book is The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech. In the first part of the interview, if you didn't get it, please go back and listen to it because there's a lot of groundwork that's been laid there. And we've been talking about how the free speech in the way that we understand it is pretty much, it's got a lot of holes in it, the way that we think about it. Free speech being part of a constitutional act took about 150 years to have any level of effect. And now we are talking about how free speech is showing up in modern society. We've talked about the history of free speech. Now we're talking about it in the context of modern society. So welcome back, Ellis. Thank you for being with us. I appreciate you being with us. And let's jump back in because now we want to talk about free speech in the modern era. Because again, the book is called The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. So the obvious question is free speech dead? That's the, do we get out the paddles and boom, is anybody there?
I think that's a huge question, which is obviously one of the reasons I wrote a book about it. And certainly not in the literal sense to say that the First Amendment has been, abolished. No, we still have the First Amendment. But what has happened is that the ability to speak has been significantly altered. And one of the landmarks of that that I look at is a famous Supreme Court decision from 2010 called Citizens United. 7 years before that, there was something called the McCain-Feingold Act, which set limits on political speech. And the reason that limits were set on political speech is that in the United States, again, this is also the case in some other countries, but particularly in the United States, you've had more and more money, corporate money, other money pouring into the arena of speech. And much of it from sources that are not quite clear, but hijacking the political dialogue in a way that only huge amounts of money can, because in the United States, unless you're advertising, which takes millions and millions of dollars, and particularly in major markets, you essentially don't have any speech. And McCain-Feingold was an attempt to put some limits on that and to say, okay, this is just getting ridiculous. You're spending $100 million for a Senate race. That doesn't make any sense. And we have a lot of research.
$1 billion political race,
right?
At a presidential level, billion plus, 2 billion,
right.
Close to now.
Which is just insane.
Yeah.
And there's a good deal of research, though one probably doesn't need to do research to understand that someone who's giving you millions of dollars is going to get a lot more access and a lot more attention paid than someone who only has a vote to offer. And so we have this phenomenon where constituents are sort of locked out of the debate because other interests have priority because they are paying loads and loads of money. And the Supreme Court under Roberts, came up with a really interesting concept, which was that corporations and other institutions have the same rights as citizens, as people. And
that law that said under Citizens United, for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically said that a corporation is the same as a person. And that allows for corporate money to pour into federal and state and all kinds of elections under Citizens United. And the problem with that, as is often the case, is this wonderful thing that politics is very good at, right and left, is the spin factor. I mean, Citizens United, wow, that must be about people. No, it's about the Koch brothers, who are billionaires pouring a ton of money into something that, and I want to put this forward to you, Ellis, because I want your point on it, that becomes what I'm seeing as somebody who is a political observer is, my love for America as a kid was that it was a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And particularly since Citizens United, although I think it's always been going on for much longer, but certainly much clearer now, is it seems to be a government of the corporation, by the corporation, for the corporation.
Yeah,
and money allows for those voices.
Oh, absolutely, and they squelch other voices because it's just the pure and naked power of that. One of that money. One of the most eloquent objections to that was actually a dissent from Stevens, who said, "Wait a minute. The founders, first of all, did not say that corporations should be equal, to individuals. First of all, there were very few corporations. Those that existed operated under special charters, and those were all negotiated. But the corporations don't die. Corporations don't vote. Corporations, and in many cases, it's not even clear who is speaking for a corporation. It's just this anonymous money that comes in and has this huge amount of influence. So to talk about violating the rights of those fictitious persons, Stevens argued, was just ridiculous. But be that as it may, that was the decision that stood. But I think the other thing that's fundamentally altered political dialogue has been an insight that political operatives had. And that insight was that truth does not necessarily win in the end. And that particularly if you have a large enough megaphone, you can lie, blatantly lie, and your point of view will become received as truth by the public. And the whole and the whole intellectual architecture behind free speech was that speech was a cleansing agent, and that it was going to allow truth to come out. And probably the best modern example of this was in the 2004 presidential race in the United States, where you had John Kerry, who was running for president against George W. Bush. And Kerry was, whatever you thought of the Vietnam War, I mean, he was a war hero from that, because he had the Bronze Star. He saved the lives of several of his shipmates. He was a captain of a so-called swift boat that went up and down, the river. And the Republican operatives decided they didn't like that part of his reputation. They didn't want a war hero running against their candidate. So they went to work on that. They got some veterans to come forth and claim that he hadn't done the things that he had been awarded for, that he was actually a coward, that he was, maybe a war criminal. And they made a book about it. They made a movie about it. They put out ads about it. And they convinced a huge number of people that they were telling the truth. This became swift voting. I think that our president recognized had the same insight, which is why his political entry or his entry into politics, was basically the falsehood of Barack Obama not being a U.S. citizen, that he somehow had been born in Kenya and apparently was smuggled into the United States and tricked his way into the state legislature and somehow fooled people into electing him president. I mean, it's a sort of preposterous tale. But by the time the election came around, a majority of Republicans believe it to be true. So we have on one hand the huge megaphone of particular interests, who can speak very loudly. We have also the insight now that truth doesn't necessarily win. So you have both a megaphone and people lying, and now we have it even more complicated because the whole machinery of the federal government is subordinate to a chief executive who puts no stock at all in the truth, even when it comes to a dangerous pandemic from which over 200,000 people, as you correctly noted, have already died. So the whole question of even when scientific entities like the Center for Disease Control speak of whether they're actually putting out what's accurate or whether they're putting out political spin has become an issue. So when I say that free speech has died, what I mean is that the very conception of free speech that we had has died necessarily because it doesn't comport with our reality. But what I'm also saying is that structurally, because of some things that are in our Constitution and derived from the Constitution, and because of the way that we elect representatives to the Senate and the way that we elect our president, don't reflect the views or the voice of the people as well.
Right. And so for me, there's an important piece here that I think is often missed, which is, first of all, I want to say that I am very pro free speech. I loved Noam Chomsky for coming out and supporting the voice of a neo-Nazi back, I think it was in the 80s or 90s. And it was like that, Noam Chomsky, a Jew, saying, yeah, you have that right? And I think it's important. So I'm vitally, vigorously in favor of free speech. And free speech means you get to lie. Free speech does mean you get to lie. It means you get to lie. It means that you get to disagree with me. You get to be all of those things. Free speech is not free to speak about the things I agree with. It's free to speak about the things I disagree with intently. But the challenge, and I think that obviously the founding fathers probably couldn't have even begun to conceive of, is that it's not just free speech, it is amplification. Because if I am running for politics against Fred, and Fred's got $1 billion and he's a piece of poo, and I'm a decent bloke who really cares about people, and I've got $50, one of our voices is going to get heard, and it isn't mine.
And that's precisely my point. That if you're lying and you have the whole megaphone of that you're granted because you have billions of dollars or because you have government position, and the opposition has no voice at all, that's not really free speech as we tend to think of it. It doesn't function.
That's why I'm asking you, Ellis. Because you and I think, agree on this, that we both very much in favor of free speech. But at the same time, it is within the realm of free speech that everybody gets to speak, including people we disagree with. And at the same time, I can pump up the volume if I've got $1 billion or if I've got a bunch of 3-letter agencies supporting me in doing so.
Right.
What's the solution? Because, to me, the solution is we have to remove money out of politics, but I don't see that happening in America any time quicker than the removal of guns in America. So, help me out here, mate. You're way more knowledgeable than I am. Help me out.
It's a huge conundrum, and
Yeah.
I think, but I think, before we even get to that, we need to separate a few things out, and one of those is that the response, censorship is one thing, and one of the famous cases of the ACLU goes back to 1978. You're talking about Noam Chomsky, but going back actually to the 1930s and the rise of Nazism in Europe.
Yes.
The ACLU had a practice of defending objectionable people like the KKK.
Yes.
And one of the questions that they found themselves confronting even back then was, why do they defend people like this? And what they basically, their argument essentially was, if we don't defend their right to speak, and then we can't defend your right to speak, and we can't come up with an objective way, content-based, to say you can't speak, even if what they say is objectionable. That resonated just as strongly in 1978 when the ACLU defended a group of neo-Nazis who wanted to march in a suburb called Skokie outside of Chicago. Skokie happened at the time to be home to a lot of Holocaust survivors who were scandalized by this whole idea. The city passed ordinances against the kind of march that the Nazis wanted to have. And the ACLU defended them, which almost caused thousands of people to resign their membership and resulted in a funding crisis of sorts. And they ultimately had a guy named David Goldberger, who was the defense attorney on that case, write a fundraising letter, which went out. And he essentially said, look, I'm a Jew. I don't like these Nazis. And in fact, I refuse to capitalize the term Nazi in this letter. He said, I think they're a bunch of creeps. He said, but I feel compelled to defend them because I also defend civil rights workers in Selma. And Selma wants to pass similar types of laws to prevent protests there. And I can't argue against that without arguing against this. And so among civil libertarians, that's been a fairly consistent argument for why you have the defense of all of these sort of noxious groups. So I think within that, though, you have a couple of issues. I mean, one is, does that protection extend to anonymous corporate benefactors of candidates, and to what extent it does? Certainly to some extent, it should extend to that. But I think that the McCain-Feingold people had the right idea. There should be limits to how much they are allowed to dominate speech. Hopefully one day, clearly not anytime soon, given the direction the Supreme Court is taking now, hopefully one day that will be revisited and they will rethink that whole set of decisions. But I think, until then, we have to really think very hard about how to give people who don't have a voice, and how to allow people who can't speak now to speak. And part of that has to do with public finance of various activities. And part of it has to do with civil society, which takes on the role of giving a voice to these people who don't have one at present.
So the extent of this is, we've seen this throughout history. So not in America, but just period.
Right.
And that is that when the people are not heard, there becomes violence in the street. It doesn't matter what country you look at that's gone that way. When the people are repressed and not heard, there's violence in the streets. And the authoritarian, or those in authority even, not even authoritarian, will try their best to repress that. I mean, I remember the changing of the laws under W around protesting him, and that
Right.
you were not allowed to protest in the street that the car ran down. You could protest a street over, but not actually on the street the car was on. Okay, that makes a big difference. That the repression that I see that is systemic has gone on, and it always results in violence. That I really want to hear your thoughts on it, because I was watching a show this morning, a news program that's international, not from the US, about the US, and I'm like, I was feeling deeply saddened thinking about the US is on the brink of a frickin' revolution.
I think we're in very dangerous territory now.
Yeah.
And my definition of speech, as you probably know, having read my book, is not just oratory. I think speech encompasses voting. I think speech encompasses representation. I think all of those are forms of speech that are in a very precarious state right now in the United States, and some of it is structural, relating going back to the Constitution. Some of the decisions that we've made. I mean, just a couple of examples. I mean, we have, for the second time in 16 years, we had a president elected who did not win the vote. I mean, you had President. Yeah, because of the Electoral College. And you had President Trump, who, even though he lost by roughly 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton, won the election. And the same thing happened with George Bush v. Gore back in 2000, which was so close it was awarded by the Supreme Court, which is another problem. But that's, but the fact that we have this system in place is problematic, because it's getting worse. The last time that happened before 2000 was 1888. At the time, and the only other time it happened was 1876. It's getting worse because we are getting, and I won't go into all the technicalities of the Electoral College, but for one thing, the size of the states is getting larger, and the disparities within those states are getting larger, and you have a winner-take-all system, so-called, by except with the exception of 2 states, whoever wins the state, wins all the electoral votes in that state, so it distorts things, and that's true not just of our presidential election, but it's also true of the way that we elect the Senate. We have 50 states. Each state gets 2 senators. So that means, and what it means in point of fact, is that you have the population, 1/6 of the population, which makes up more than 50% of the senators. So 1/6 of the population has total veto power.
Yes.
Over appointments to the Supreme Court, over all executive appointees, over much of what is governance in the United States, and can force his will. You have this, this minority can force his will on the majority. And one of the reasons is that the disparities in size between the states is larger than it's ever been. Yeah. Certainly.
You've got senators from South Dakota,
right?
You've got 2, and then you've got 2 from California or New York State. There's a little few more people there.
Yeah, well, California has close to 40 million people. Wyoming has about 500,000. There's a disparity of, California is 66 times the size of Wyoming.
Right.
But they have the exact same representation. It's only so far that can go. There's a distortion. And what distorts it even further is that in the United States, we're racially polarized, and so, and ethnically polarized. Mm-hmm. So you have roughly 50%, over 50% of Latinos in only 3 states, New Mexico, Florida, California. Those 3 states, that's the majority of Latino votes. And so no matter how many more Latinos move into those states, they are not going to get any more votes, or at least not a proportional share.
They all have to move to Wyoming and South Dakota and North Dakota.
Right. And it's the same thing in a different way with African Americans. You have 106 counties in America that are majority Black. 105 of those are in the South. Well, you have over 50% of the Black population in the South, but you have no state that has a majority Black population. There's very racialized voting, particularly in the South. So what that means is that throughout all the red states, many of which are in the South, most of which are in the South by calculation, Blacks don't have a vote when it comes to the president. Because they're not in the majority in those states, and they're all winner take all. So whatever the majority decides is what rules. That will ultimately change as demographics change in this country.
Right. So, Ellis, I just want to stop you for a minute, because I want to make sure we're not going off into a tangent that people don't understand. Because I am familiar with winner takes all, and I understand what that means. But every conversation I have with somebody about winner takes all, I've not met too many people who actually know what that means. And so it doesn't make sense to a lot of people even listening right now. So if you can give us a concise,
sure,
what that
basically
means for people in the context of, like you said, black votes just disappear because of it.
Basically, what it means is that in the U.S. system, we don't have a direct democracy. We vote on electors, and then the electors vote on the president. But in 48 of the 50 states, the states have decided that the system should be one where what the majority of the electors are decide. All the electors have to vote with the majority vote. And so if you have, in Mississippi, let's say, if you have 60% of people who vote for one candidate and 40% who vote for another candidate, all of Mississippi's votes go to the candidate who the 60% voted for. And because the United States, unfortunately, is so racialized, blacks and whites tend to vote for different candidates. And also because the political parties are very racialized, and I won't bore you with the whole history of it, but going back to the 1970s, the Republican Party made a conscious decision which was that essentially they were going to become the party that was the successor to what was called the Dixiecrats, the segregationist forces. And they have more and more become the party of white people. Before that, a considerable number of blacks and other minorities voted for Republicans. After that, very few. So you have this stark polarization that has occurred racially as well, and the result is that you have a minority government in the United States. And it's not only a minority government, it's a minority government within a minority. And it becomes just insane. So you have, we're now facing a new opening on the Supreme Court, which has 9 members. And what will happen if the president has his way is that he will appoint a judge, whose viewpoints are totally out of line with most of Americans. And you will have 9 judges on the Supreme Court, 9 justices on the Supreme Court, 7 of whom have points of view that most Americans radically disagree with. And they are in charge of whether or not people get health care. They'll be in charge of whether or not women can have a right to abortion. They'll be in charge of voting rights and to what extent those are protected in various states. That sets up a lot of tension in society because a lot of people feel disenfranchised. And I said it's getting worse because the populations of the states is continuing to diverge in ways. And we have the structural problem where without a constitutional amendment, we can't change some of these things.
Do you see that even possible? Let's pretend that we're moved into the future and, it's a 4-4 Supreme Court with one who's sort of in the middle. Do you see a constitutional amendment being even in the realm of possibility? Because
possibly, but probably not. But for the Supreme Court, the interesting thing about the Supreme Court is that the Constitution does not set a number for justice on the Supreme Court. So if in fact the Senate changes parties, if in fact Democrats become in control of the Senate in the next election, they actually will have the Democrats will actually have the power, if they decide to take it, to enlarge the Supreme Court and to appoint new members, additional members. That's very controversial. I mean, after the last time that effort was tried, it was by FDR back in the 1930s, and he didn't succeed because the Senate didn't go along with him. But there's nothing that constitutionally bars them from that. I think that will
be 12, 13, whatever it is,
whatever number they choose. So I think that's very possible. And given the frustration with the way things are going now, given the anger over the sense that you now have an illegitimate president who didn't really win the vote, and who, to the extent he did win, had help from various sectors, some of it foreign. I think there might be enough outrage to cause that to change. I think the part of the fundamental inequity in the United States has to do, as I was talking about the composition of the Senate, that does require a constitutional amendment.
Right.
And in fact, the founders put in a trick clause in the amendment in the Constitution where they basically say, and I'm paraphrasing here, that no state can be deprived without its permission of its representation in the U.S. Senate. So that has not been litigated, but is very likely to be litigated if, in fact, they attempt to have a constitutional change, with smaller states saying, wait a minute, the Constitution says that you can't change this in a way that diminishes our vote. So it's a mess. I think there's a lot of friction, and I think there's a lot of tension and a lot of pressure for change. I not totally seriously, but not totally non-seriously, I have a suggestion in my book to how to correct at least some of the problems of this, given our racialized voting patterns. And what I basically argue is that foundations in civil society ought to take it upon themselves to encourage what I'm calling a great migration. We had a great migration in the 20th century in this country, where African Americans, because of segregation in the South and the inability to vote, inability to work in anything like equitable way, decided that they were going to move. And right. So they moved to the North, they moved to Chicago, they moved to New York, they moved in large measure, but clearly not totally out of the South. What I'm saying is that because we have very racialized patterns in the United States, if you just move a few million people to places like Wyoming and places like North Dakota and South Dakota, that's going to have a revolutionary impact on representation in those states. And particularly now, when a lot of people are suffering, they will welcome the chance for a new start somewhere else. And that could at least be a jerry-rigged way to deal with some of these huge problems of representational inequality within America.
You bring up something very interesting there, Ellis, because with my background in psychology, what I know is human beings don't like to change, and they cling to crap. They literally cling to crap. They'll cling to they stay in abusive relationships with bosses, with partners in life, and even in political systems. They cling. It's one of the things I had political conversation the other day where I was talking about, I'm really fascinated with Germany post, during, and pre the Second World War. And I don't believe that Germany was full of Nazis pre-Second World War. I don't believe that for a second.
Right.
But I do believe there were a lot of people who went, and by the way, a lot of Jews who went, this will probably blow over and it'll be okay. And, my family is here and my roots are here and my culture is here and my history is here. And then the Nazi party came in and, many of them were shipped off to Auschwitz and places like that. And then there were many Germans who were not Nazis who stayed there, who totally disagreed with the political party of the day, who didn't agree with any of it, but kept their mouths shut. And in the words of Martin Luther King, for evil to continue, good people just have to shut up. My paraphrase, of course. And so I look at this abusive relationship that Black people are in places in the South, and I'm like, logically, rationally, I feel as frustrated as I did back in the day, 30 plus years ago when I was a therapist, and I used to say to people, why the hell don't you just leave the relationship? It's abusive. And they go, yeah, but this is my home and the kids are here. And I'm like, oh my God, because it's got nothing to do with logic. And
right.
So that idea you have of saying, okay, let's do a mass migration to Wyoming is about as Southern Fried Chicken in Wyoming. Yeah, I'm not doing that. Right. So, but
the kicker is you don't have to move that many people because the numbers are so huge in terms of the disparities, and because some of the states. As I said, Wyoming doesn't even have 1 million people. So if you move, a couple 100,000 in Wyoming, you're going to change that state in a huge way. out of a population of, tens of millions. So it's possible. I mean, do I actually expect foundations to call me up and say, how do we do this? Probably not. Though I have heard from a couple.
Really?
And said this is an interesting idea. So
keep me in the loop. I want to know about that one.
So maybe something will happen with that. I guess we'll see. But I also, I mean, I principally put it in there to make a point, and just to sort of say, look, this is crazy, and we need to figure out some way around this. But I thought where you were going to go is that people get attached to things, and they want to keep them, and so
exactly it. That's my point exactly.
But and that includes the Constitution. I mean, this thing has been around. The Constitutional Convention was in 1787, and so we have the oldest Constitution of any democracy in the world, and the founding fathers have taken on the status of gods. I mean, these were people who couldn't make any mistakes, and who had perfect foresight, and who anticipated every possible problem that a democracy would face. And obviously that's not true. Obviously. But because we have this reverence for this document, there's a great reluctance to change it when there are some things that just scream for change. And what I point out, of course, in my book is, yes, these founders were brilliant people, but they also gave us the right to change this Constitution. That's why they came up with this idea of amendments. Yeah. So, yeah, and their assumptions, the kind of government they had back then, is not the kind of government we have now, and the kind of society they had back then is not the kind of society that we have now. And the whole idea, going back to the whole question of electors, the whole idea behind having electors, well, because first of all, ordinary people were too stupid to know who to elect, and too uninformed, and they would not even know who to choose, because at that time the only politician who was uniformly known was George Washington. And you can't have George Washington as president forever. And so electors would know who to choose, and they would be able. And the idea, so funny, from looking at it from today's perspective, was that they would look at the cream of the crop, the best that America had to offer, and they would sift through these people, and then they would come up with the people that Congress ultimately or some other body could end up voting upon. Well, what we have now is nothing like that. I mean, electors are basically political hacks, sworn to whoever their party coughs up. That's a far cry from having these very distinguished people who take the time of finding out the cream of the crop among America's thinkers, and then take that select group of men, because it was all men back then, that select group of men, and decide which one is going to be allowed to compete for the presidency. So yeah, we are reluctant to change, and I'm not quite sure how you get around that, barring what seems to be what we seem to be inviting, which is violent disruption, because people are so frustrated.
Do you think, from your observation, do you think there's a possibility of a non-corporate entity being in a political place of power, whether that is, say, a Tammy Duckworth, or, or a third party interest? I grew up as a kid, I grew up in the UK, and one of the things I loved about that was that there was 6 weeks run up to the election maximum. Right. Money was very restricted about what went in. And there were multiple parties to choose from. Yes, there were two dominant parties, of course, but there was very rarely a majority government. It was mostly, sometimes it was a minority government, but there was usually other members in the parliament to have the voice. And that, when I see and I look at these political hacks that I see actually on both sides, who go along with the party line, because they have to, rather than really, I mean, whether one agrees with Bernie Sanders or not, I feel like, they've stolen it from him twice. And whether it's the best choice or not, I can see politically as a maneuverability, as a strategy. Yeah, I totally get why he wasn't in this time and why Biden's been put in. But do you think it's possible that that the U.S. can move to a place of either a third party or a non-corporate entity individual?
I certainly think it's possible, and if we look at our history, I mean, the Republican Party came into existence in the 1850s, for instance. It didn't exist before then. It was the Free State sort of party, and it's evolved since then. And I'm not sure it's sustainable long term as a party. I think they have this moment where they are trying to consolidate judges and other conservative operatives in place because they see that they are not a majority party, and I think their viability as a majority party is in question. And then it's going to be what the process is by what replaces that and how it gets replaced, and whether it's replaced by one party or splits into two. And but I think that long term we're inevitably moving away from our sort of rigid two-party system. I just don't see exactly how that's going to happen. But I think, as I said, we have one party that's totally non-viable at this point.
I think that the Democratic Party was arrogant when it went to put in Hillary and wrote off Trump, and I think that was a foolish mistake. And the Trump presidency has given the Democratic Party an opportunity to reshuffle. I don't know if it's particularly done that. The Trump presidency has created the Trump party, and then you have genuine conservative Republicans who looking more like the Lincoln Project now and groups like that, who are definitely not for Trump and have seen their party co-opted by that movement. It's the America and political America I fell in love with as a kid. I was a kid and it was illusionary, but it was the JFK era, and it was this wonderful idea of what America was. And yes, I was awakened by Martin Luther King when I was 10 years old, while at the same time listening to Scott McKenzie singing "Let's Go to San Francisco" and talking about flower power and the summer of love. This crazy dichotomy of realities in America at that time, but it was still this wonderful ideal that something was pushing forward and into an evolution, and it seems to have stopped because of exactly the comment you made earlier, which is money. And my challenge is I can't see money coming out of politics. I just can't. I don't know how that would happen any more than I said than guns coming off the
right.
So this is a fascinating conversation. You are a fascinating man and obviously very knowledgeable about what it is. Where do you, if there is not because Trump has actually said, and as we're recording this, he said it very recently, that there might not be a peaceful transition of power. And he's putting the Supreme Court in place that he can fight to the Supreme Court. I was asked this morning about it, and I said, if it goes the way, because Trump is masterful at keeping things in courts, and somebody said, well, what do you think will happen? I said, he could have a 10-year position. And they're like, he can't do that. And I go, yeah, he could, because he's got 4 years. Then he's going to take 2 years to fight in the Supreme Court about this, to get to the Supreme Court and get the thing, and then claim a win because he's put the Supreme Court justices in place. And then he'll say, but my term starts today, so that's 10 years, 4, 2, 4. Am I crazy, or is that? Do you see?
Well, you're not crazy, but I don't think. I think it's very unlikely that could happen for a
Thank
few
you.
reasons.
I'm glad to hear it.
Okay.
Sometimes I'm really glad to be wrong.
I think first of all, unless you have an extremely close election, what ended up making 2000 a cliffhanger was it was an extremely close election, yes. And one state, Florida, was going to determine that. And so the legal question that went to the Supreme Court had to do with whether they would permit the continual recounting of the ballots, yes. In Florida, which in that recounting probably would have awarded the Florida's votes to Gore as opposed to Bush, though no one actually knew that, no one actually conceded that at the time. And they decided on a fairly technical issue that the states did not need to continue recounting the votes, that the original count was fine, and therefore that that Bush should be president. That would not have been possible if there had been a larger vote, and if other states had, were also in contention, and so because it was one state and a narrow sort of issue, the Supreme Court sort of got decided. Also, under the provisions of the U.S. Constitution, if the electors cannot decide on a candidate, and then the state legislators get to re-choose electors in effect, and ultimately
looking at doing right now, right?
Right, but ultimately it gets thrown to the Congress. And it gets thrown to the Congress, and then we're left with sort of this weird thing where each state gets one vote, and so it's still disproportional. So long story short, if it's unclear, Trump can't just extend this by going to the courts. It will ultimately go to Congress, and Congress will decide who the president is. And that would be a very unfortunate thing, but none of that happens unless the election is reasonably close.
But that's fine in a normal election year, but this is not a normal election year.
Right.
And the contesting is around the ballots. Now we know the contesting rationally, logically is nonsense, but that is the contesting is on the ballot thing. And that illegal ballots and blah, and that's his argument for this process, and so it doesn't actually even matter if it's close or not, because you say, well, it's invalid. I mean, that's
true, and if he can get enough judges to go along with him, then I think we will have a real mess. Judges so far I'm not giving an indication that's what they're going to do. But yes, if he can get enough judges to go along with that argument, then we can end up with a real mess. But even so, if that happens, it's going to end up in Congress, and then Congress is going to make the decision.
Yeah, because there's nothing in the Constitution about the transference of power, because it's relied on the good manners of those in power to concede, and relying on the good manners of a Captain Pumpkinhead. You might.
No, there's nothing about the transfer of power, but there's a lot that's been since jury built into it about how you can make a decision in the absence of a clear decision. But yes, the courts can throw a monkey wrench in that, and I guess we just have to see. I doubt that's going to happen. I mean, only a fool makes absolute predictions in this political environment. But given all the polls now which show a certain thing, I think it's going to be very difficult for Trump to claim that voter fraud has deprived him of enough ballots that he has a legitimate claim to the presidency. I may stand corrected, a couple of months from now, but I sort of doubt that's going to happen.
As I said, we live in very interesting times. I think that this is, in my view, the greatest wake up of America
since the Civil War.
Since the Civil War.
Yeah.
And the potential for that wake up and what it means to people is going to be enormous. And I think that people have really got to grasp what that means. They've really got to grasp what that means, whether you're black or white or anything else, whether your political affiliation is on the left or the right. I think that people have really got to wake up to what this is. And I think that part of the danger for somebody like me is that there are things that are glaringly obvious to me from a psychological and a political viewpoint that are not glaringly obvious to others. And that's where I have to manage myself and go, can't people see this? But again, can't people see they're in an abusive relationship? No, not really. They keep doing it. And as that sports coach said, I can't remember who it was, and he said, the black people of America, I don't know why we continue to love America when it doesn't love us back. It's an abusive relationship. And I thought that was very moving for me to hear that.
I mean, I certainly totally agree with you that this is a major reckoning. I think that most of us had no idea how fragile our democracy was, and because we've had chief executives who were gentlemen and who it would step aside when they needed to step aside and whatnot, and we now have someone who's operating under a totally different playbook, and we just were not prepared for that.
Yeah, it's like I said, it is a great awakening.
But I think also some of the structural problems constitutionally in American governance are now coming to the fore in a way that they weren't so obvious a few years ago.
Yeah, one of the things I did a video on this, and I said the video was called "I'm Afraid," and I said I'm not afraid for the reasons you think I am. Here I'm a white guy living in North America. I'm not afraid because of the things you think I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that. I remember the tents being put up across the world after the recession, right?
Right.
And they all went away, and nobody even remembers them anymore. I'm afraid that somebody will buy a big rug and sweep all this under, and a lot of these things will just disappear, and people will go back to, oh, it's fine, and not make the changes that need to be changed. And that is what really concerns me, that there is a need for constitutional change. There is a need for political change in the structure of the parties. There is a need for, people to actually trust Congress and trust the Senate. Those things are not happening. This is a great awakening, but I'm afraid that people are groggy, and from the constant barrage of craziness. And by that, I don't just mean Trump and the political parties. Mm-hmm. I mean, wildfires and hurricanes and everything else and pandemics. Add all that together, and I think people are like, I want to just breathe. I just want to exhale and chill the hell out for a while. And the problem with that is that it's easier to go and just slide right back into normal. That is what concerns me.
Oh, I think you're right. I think there are some forces that are pushing us in a way that's not going to let that happen, though.
I really hope you're right. Ellis, it has been a pleasure and an honor, sir. I thank you so much for being with us. Again, please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you, the name of your book, where they can find the book, and all the wonderful resources you have.
Yes, the book is called The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. My name is Ellis Cose. That's ELLISCOSE. My website is elliscose.com. And it has plenty of information on my books, on me, and on my work.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure and honor. I hope you'll stay with us to the end. And for you, dear listener, you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode that you've been listening to or any past episodes inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. The fact is that it doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your capability. Find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist or executive advisor for yourself or your organization. Go to dovbaron.com, because unified meaning, or as we called it, finding your dragonfire, is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness in both individuals and in companies. I truly believe with everything in my being that we may have lost compassion in politics. We may have even lost compassion in religion and faith a lot of the time. But maybe as leaders, as even corporate leaders, we can stand up for what's right and bring compassion back into the world. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you need to claim free speech, own it, and stand up for what really matters to you, even if you don't agree with me. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your dragonfire to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out. Bye.